It is less than a year now until the next US presidential election and just hours until the UK's national result. But young people like these, they won't be getting a say. Is it time to lower the voting age? Welcome to Roundtable. A very warm welcome from me, David Foster. At 16, there are many ways you are seen as an adult in the eyes of the law and society. But here in the UK and many other countries, voting is not one of them. And there's an increasingly vocal campaign for that to change.
As young people around the world take to the streets and take the lead on issues like the climate crisis and social inequality, many are questioning why they don't have the right to vote. Frustrated by the political gridlock of Brexit in the run-up to the country's general election, many 16 and 17-year-olds have been demanding the right to vote. They argue as they have the right to drive, get jobs, pay income tax, and even join the army, they should also be allowed to join the democratic process. In Europe, it's been more than 10 years since Austria moved the general voting age to 16. In March this year, Malta became the second European Union country to do the same. And 16-year-olds in Germany, Scotland and Wales are able to vote at local elections. But voting age reform continues to divide opinions in the UK. Opponents question the political maturity of teenagers and say 18 is the recognised age of adulthood. Turnout remains a huge challenge. In the UK's general election of 2017, YouGov estimated only 57% of 18 to 19-year-olds voted, compared to 84% of over 70s. So is it time for votes at 16?
Very pleased to say that with me at the round table today we have Mete Coban, Chief Exec of the youth charity My Life, My Say. Dr. Kaat Smets joins us, Senior Lecturer in Politics at Royal Holloway University in London. Dr. Thomas Loughran here as well, from the Lowering the Voting Age project at the University of Huddersfield. Look, a little bit later in the programme, we're going to hear from somebody in a country where they have lowered the voting age. But your project, Thomas, finishes next year.
It does.
What have you found out? What are the headlines?
Well, I think we found several things that I think are interesting in terms of what they add to the existing debate. Those that are in favour of lowering the voting age are not making arguments related to whether they feel mature enough. Their argument is very much based on the idea that they have the right to say as young people, that young people have a unique contribution to make to politics and their voice should be heard.
And with your work with young people, is that what they tell you?
Well, absolutely.
That it's my right rather than something that I'm going to use because I feel the need to change the world?
Well, I think, if you look at what's happened in our country over the past couple of years, we've got some big decisions that we're going to be making around sort of the future of the country, around Brexit. And, last time in the referendum, 1.4 million young people aged 16 and 17 were denied the right to be able to participate in that referendum. And I think, ultimately they will be living with the outcome the longest. So it seems completely mind-blowing that they don't have a right to vote, but then people on the other spectrum who probably won't live with the outcome as long as young people aged 16 and 17 will have the right to decide that future.
But Kat, in your opinion, talking to young people, I know it's anecdotal to some extent, you reckon they don't really want to do this, most of them that you've spoken to?
Yes, correct. I often talk to 16 and 17-year-olds who come to university for taster lectures, and I always ask them about whether they would like to have the right to vote, and most of them actually tell me they don't. And they do actually bring up the maturity argument. They don't consider themselves mature enough to vote. And then if you ask 18-year-olds who are actually at university, they certainly think they weren't mature enough when they were 16 or 17-year-olds.
OK, so your opinion, your experience is slightly different, I think, Thomas. You
Yes.
say most of them say that they do think that they're old enough and mature enough.
I think
I want to go to the maturity argument a little bit later in detail, but yeah, is that right?
I mean, firstly, I'll say our survey shows 72% support among 16 and 17-year-olds for lowering the voting age. I think it's worth pointing out, though, that there's two important qualifiers to that. One is that where you do get the maturity argument, it tends to be from those young people that are less committed to voting, are less sure about voting, the reasons they give for not wanting to vote tend to be related to maturity. What I think is interesting is the ones who are in favour of the vote do not see it through a maturity lens. They see it through...
well, that's pretty obvious, though, isn't it? I mean, you know, if you think you should have the vote, then you're going to think you're mature enough. If you don't think you're mature enough, you're not necessarily going to want the vote.
It's more that they don't talk about it in terms of maturity at all. That they see it in terms of it's about their voice as young people, being heard in the system and being responded to.
How would society change, do you think, if it came down? And the UK has been this way since about 1970. How would society change if it suddenly became 16?
In a very positive way. I mean, look, ultimately you can marry an MP at the age of 60, but you can't vote for one.
OK, I'm going to stop you there. Yeah. With your parents' consent.
Yeah.
Carry on.
But the point is, you could join the army, you could
Can
work.
I stop you again?
Yeah.
With your parents' consent.
Yeah, but you're
not
still
considered an adult. Those two things are used as examples.
But if
you have to say to mummy and daddy,
but
can't do it.
There is no factual evidence to suggest that young people aged 16 and 17 are not responsible.
Well, why do you think society has put this arbitrary age limit?
Well, if you take Scotland, for example, where you did have 16 and 17-year-olds voting in the Scottish referendum, you had a 71% turnout.
Mete, you know why that was. That's because they wanted... The people who wanted Scottish independence wanted them to vote because they expected to get more positives from the youth vote. It's not because they thought young people were disenfranchised, they just wanted their vote.
I mean, look, through my work, through My Life, My Say, I meet young people across the country. We organise democracy cafes across the country. We've done actually 60 of those this year. And actually through those democracy cafes, you know, more than 60-70% of the participants are 16 and 17-year-olds. And what I see on the streets is that young people aged 16 and 17 are extremely intelligent enough to be able to decide for themselves about how the future of their country is governed, but more importantly, it's the right thing to do. I mean, why is it that they shouldn't be able to vote in their country, in the future of their country?
Well, perhaps because they're not old enough, but there are other countries where they have made this decision. You mentioned Scotland and the referendum, Malta earlier this year. They've been doing this in Austria for 11 years now. I had a chance to talk to Paul Schmidt about this. He's from the Austrian Society for European Politics. I asked him, had it worked or not?
For Austria, I can say that lowering the voting age has been a positive experience, in fact. We started out well with quite a boost in turnout. Then in the subsequent elections, the track record of the turnout was a little mixed because there was less public attention and we didn't have as many accompanying measures as we had in the beginning. But I think in the last European elections, for example, the participation rate of the youth between 16 and 29 was quite high. It increased 18 points compared to the elections to the European Parliament in 2014. So I think the trend is a positive one.
Let's go over some of those figures because 2008 it first came in. 2013 is the national election you were talking about. It was an 88% turnout first time, went down to 63%. And generally that is replicated in other countries. When people turn 18, their interest tends to drop off between that and the age of 24. So could it be said that it's just a novelty thing at the very beginning and the interest just wanes because they're young people?
I think what's important to state is that it is not enough to lower the voting age. It has to be accompanied by other measures. There has to be an honest political interest in getting the youth to vote. I mean, for the democratic and political system, this is really a key issue. You need to introduce measures in school. There needs to be political education on all school levels because you need to get the youth informed to motivate them, to energize them, to mobilize them, and to improve their participation and also their representation because it's about their future and they need to be part of the decision.
The reason for lowering the voting age in Austria at that time, was it because it was felt that young people did not have a say in their future?
I mean, the idea was that the youth should have more of a say about their own future. It should be them determining how their future should look like. I mean, there were also, of course, political reasons, party political reasons for that, because at that time, some of the political parties expected to have a higher support, in fact, by the youth, which then materialized as well but this is just part of the story. I mean, the important thing is that the democratic system, and in a moment where people get older and older, in order to have a healthy democracy, you need to get the youth into the system and have them have a valid say about their future. I think that's the crucial point.
I know it varies from person to person, but is it generally felt that 16-year-olds have the maturity to take part in this, that they understand what they're voting for?
I think it's nothing given. I mean, you need to give them the tools, and you need to give them, to inform them and to talk to them about the ways of participating, which then helps them taking part in this democratic act. Just voting, just lowering the voting age is not enough.
And my thanks then to Paul Schmidt from the Austrian Society for European Politics. We're going to kick around a few of the points that he made. One thing he talked about, Kaat, was maturity. And there are those who believe that 50 years ago, 16-year-olds were more mature than they are today. Fair point?
It depends on how you think about maturity,
They had more responsibility, they knew more about the world, they were in the place of work.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. We know that the transition to adulthood in terms of a number of social markers, so I'm talking about leaving education, starting your first job, getting married, starting a family, this is all moved to a higher average age. So from that point of view, it's certainly true that young people are less mature.
You were disagreeing, you were shaking your head there, Mete.
I mean, look, this is the stereotype about young people and millennials and Gen Z nowadays is that, you know, we're too lazy, we're too apathetic, we're too dependent on elders to sort of fix our career paths for us. But when you actually look at some of the biggest change, you know, young people are leading social change on a daily basis. Look at youth climate strikes. I mean, I was just up in Newcastle where they had a huge rally of young people aged all the way from the age of 11 all the way to 18, campaigning, taking it to their local politicians about really shaking up political institutions. I think, you know, there is no way which you can measure sort of maturity and, you know, the idea that...
Well, let me give you an example. Professor Abigail Baird, psychologist, neuroscientist, Vassar College in New York, and she says, she's talking about MRIs, brain scans, forced to speculate, I would say an 18-year-old brain 50 years ago probably looked more like a 23-year-old brain now. In other words, we grow up later.
But, you know, look, that's no reason why young people aged 16 and 17 shouldn't be given the right to vote. The idea that...
I suppose one of the points she's making is it could be like having given a 13-year-old back in 1968 the right to vote. The 16-year-old's maturity is comparable to that.
I think, David, you're entering a very slippery slope where we're starting to judge whether people are qualified enough to vote. And, you know, the question I would ask back to you is if we're going to scrutinise young people aged 16 and 17, or even 18, 19, 20 in that way, or young people in that way, why don't we do the same, for example, for 30-year-olds, for 40-year-olds? If people have certain medical conditions, you question them as well. So why is it that young people are unfairly treated in the way that other age groups aren't?
Well, there are those who would argue that it should go back up to 21, but that's for another day. But Thomas, let me ask you about civic engagement.
Sure.
You know, in other words, education. Know why you're voting, know what the issues are, etc., etc. Where do you start with an education like that?
I mean, this is absolutely a critical issue. I mean, particularly out of our focus groups, again, when I spoke earlier about the high level of support we see among young people for votes at 16 and the fact that they want to vote, that's often comes concurrently and a bit contradictorily with their views that they're not confident to vote. They often don't feel
okay,
they have...
so they want to learn more.
They want to vote.
But where do you start? What programmes should there be?
Well, one issue that comes out time and time again is the idea that young people really want to know more about the content of politics. Often when we frame citizenship education and civics education, we tend to go into a comfort zone of talking about the structure of politics, how many MPs are in Parliament, what the electoral system is. This does not seem to engage young people into politics. It doesn't seem to be the political education. So when you say... they want to know what parties stand for. They want to know how to make political assessments. And at the moment, the citizenship education system tends to shy away somewhat from
that. But that is almost impossible, isn't it? Trying to nail jelly to the wall. I heard it described as trying to get true political opinions the other day. So by definition, is going to be a really difficult task, isn't it?
There's no doubt that it's challenging, and one of the main challenges is
Particularly with young brains.
It's
I'm
more,
not being condescending.
It's
here,
more
by the way.
challenging.
I don't think I am. Anyway.
It's more challenging from the perspective of teaching. It's more challenging from the perspective of teachers feeling uncomfortable with teaching more contentious political issues. So the problem is that young people want to learn about these issues. That's their kind of route into politics. We know that young people have a more issue-orientated approach to politics, and they want to know how they can connect those issues to the party system. But understandably, teachers are a bit reticent to teach that because of perceptions of bias.
Which leads me to the next point. If they're interested at that age, and I suggested to Paul that it was perhaps novelty value because the interest fell off later on. That's one of the biggest problems, isn't it? I mean, they're fascinated at the beginning, but pretty quickly they become either bored or disillusioned.
Yes, although we do know that the first elections that someone is allowed to vote are more important. So if you vote in those first elections, then you're more likely to continue voter in later life. So from that perspective, the Austrian example could be a very positive one.
Well, I mean, just go back to those figures. 88% of the youth vote, 16, 17-year-olds, turned out first time around. 63% of those who had since become 16 or 17 did it then.
Yeah.
And what does that say? That the whole idea is sort of, well, it's gone off the boil, hasn't it? I'll come to you in just a minute, Mete, yeah?
Yeah, it does appear that in Austria there was something of a novelty effect, and that's very likely to happen elsewhere too, of course.
You don't believe that's going to be the case, though, do you, if it's lowered in this country?
Well, I think, taking the Austrian examples, we heard some very good anecdotes there. But, the reality is that young people do care about issues that affect them. Of course, they care about whether they've got a roof over their shoulders or a job that pays them basic respect or dignity. The problem is whether they see traditional forms of politics as a vehicle to address the issues that they care about. Now, we have an election on Thursday in the UK where you still have to go back to your local polling station to vote. There is no system in 2019 where you can actually check if you're registered to vote online. So there is something about our democracy being outdated. How do we make it fit for purpose in the 21st century? So do we introduce online voting? Do we make election days public holidays?
More relevant to young people.
Of course, yeah. And more importantly, there was something about representation. Now, where you look in the UK, where there's only, I think it's only 2 or 3 MPs under the age of 30 in our political institutions, this is said for all equality groups. When you look at these political institutions, of course, there's an automatic barrier there because when you look at them, there is no one who looks and sounds like you who can represent your interests. So I think there is...
they'd have to be 15 or 16 to look and sound like you, wouldn't
No, not necessarily, but if they see someone who's young and energetic with fresh new ideas, I think we have to think...
And who has little life experience?
Not necessarily little file experience. I mean, I come from a place, in Hackney in London. The types of experiences that I have, I picked up much earlier than someone in their 20s and 30s would have had just because of the circumstances that I was brought up in. So I think the idea that, everyone walks in this parallel life is false.
Where do you draw the line? If it's 16 next time, what about 15, 14? Somebody suggested, a professor of politics at Cambridge University, Professor Runciman, says 6. Why not 6?
Yeah, I mean, the essence, as I understand it, of David Runciman's argument is the idea of rebalancing out the electorate. So his idea is that at the moment the electorate, the voting patterns are very much in favour of older people. The voting system favours older people, and therefore political parties produce policies that are designed to favour older people. The idea, and Runciman's idea, is that you extend out the electorate to 6, and therefore to balance that out. I think the point he's making...
Free entry to Gummy World and things like that.
Yeah, the point he's making, I think, is that it's about whether you view voting as an individual right or about an issue of collective voice. And that's quite important. And young people seem to, in some cases, see it as one or the other. So they want to be heard as young people.
He's making a point, really, isn't he? Yeah. He doesn't mean it seriously. But where do you draw the line? Why not 15? Why not 14?
I think what's quite interesting when we ask this question in our focus groups is how wedded to 16 young people actually are. We were sort of expecting people who were strongly in favour of lowering the voting age to 16 and had that narrative about young people really wanting to vote, actually being quite open to lowering it below that. But actually, they seem to see 16 as the correct age. They seem to see 16 at the age at which certain responsibilities coalesce. They often talk about the fact that that's the age at which they need to make educational decisions about their future, going on to A-levels. It's the age when someone will go into work. that seems to feel to a lot of advocates, at least, like the natural age. It's quite rare you find someone who's prepared to advocate for it going lower.
What about this one? If you can get married at 16 with your parents' permission, if you can join the armed forces at 16 with your parents' permission, what about allowing parents to have a say in who their children vote for at 16, running it past mum and dad?
Well, I think voting is an individual right, so I don't think that should be the idea, to have your parents consent to vote or what to vote for. I don't think I haven't heard of anyone advocating that.
No, neither have I, really. But, I mean, it sort of implies that there's a borderline area here, isn't there? Between being old enough to make totally responsible adult decisions, such as fighting for your country or committing yourself to somebody else in a marriage partnership for life, and voting. It is difficult to decide whether there is that level of responsibility there. I was being slightly facetious.
I mean, look, I think 16 is the right age because that's the point where you're going through that major transformation in your life, where it was alluded to earlier about you're having to make life decisions about, you know, the future, around, you know, your education, around your employment. And even if you join the army...
If I remember rightly, it's an incredibly confusing time because of that.
Of course, yeah, but, you know, I mean, there are lots of different examples of different ages that you go through when you finish university where you have to... It's confusing as well, but the reality is, you know, young people are, as we're seeing at the moment, are very engaged in politics. You see 1.5 million young people aged under 25 have registered to vote within just 5 weeks of the election being called. I think we saw that in 2017 where we had the youth quake. I think, you know, Brexit has politicised a generation in the UK, a bit like the Scottish referendum in Scotland. And I think, you know, stopping them from having a say on what's going to impact their futures, I think it's the wrong thing to do.
What about if young people aren't enfranchised here, they feel disenfranchised? What about the idea of older people having the vote taken away from them, rather like they can have their car licence taken away from them? Over the age of 75, sorry, you're going to shuffle off this mortal coil fairly soon. What's the point in you voting?
There is a rather more controversial measure proposed by a Dutch political theorist who says that democratic theorist who says that people should have the number of votes should count double depending on when they were born. So an older person would get 1 vote, and someone between 18 to 24 would get 5, and it would balance out. But it's a similar point to what Runciman was making. I think practically this is clearly not a viable option. But there's no doubt that when you talk to young people, you do get a bit of generational tension, and this kind of idea that decisions are being made on our behalf that are going to have a long-term impact on our lives that we haven't had the opportunity to say.
And people will never like having anything taken away from them. Once you have lowered the voting age to 16, that is it. It's going to stay there or perhaps go lower. What are the chances of that happening in the UK? Following Austria's example, Malta's example, Scotland's little example with the referendum.
Lowering from 18 to 16, yeah. I think we're heading in that direction. Yes, because Scotland has already started, Wales. I think generally the trend is towards lowering the voting age to 16.
And what difference will that make to society?
I think we are extending the franchise to a group of people that is less likely to vote. I think that in the long term it will lower voter turnout, just like voter turnout has decreased after lowering the voting age from 21 to 18, after extending the right to vote to women. So if the goal is to increase political participation, voter turnout, then I am not convinced that this is the right way.
So, My Life, My Say, your charity, it's a novelty. Great the first time you do it, can't be bothered after that. What do you think?
Well, I think, look, again, research, as you said earlier, shows that if young people participate voting in their first election, they're more likely to continue. I think capturing them at the age where they're just finishing...
Oh, my God, I've voted in 4 elections now, nothing's changed.
But I think, you know, that's...
Jaundice, cynicism, it sets in.
But that's true across all ages, David. I don't think it's exclusive just to young people. I think
Protect them then. Don't let them be part of the process when they're so vulnerable.
I think what's a really important question is after this election, I think there's a big question mark about what our parliamentary democracy looks like. And I think that's what sort of Brexit has exposed, a growing intergenerational divide in this country. It's exposed a big divide between towns and cities across the country. And I think there's a serious conversation about how we update our democracy to make it sure it's fit for purpose, but also proper leadership. I mean, In 2008, when people went to vote for Obama, people were infused to go out and vote. People were planning weeks in advance, whereas in the UK, we're not getting that. And mistrust between young people and politicians is growing. So we need to find a way in which we make politics more representative so that people are inspired.
It's fascinating. I think it will happen. But the idea that we're going to have a total review and shake-up of the parliamentary system, which would probably involve parliamentarians themselves deciding to vote themselves out of a job, it's a little bit like the voting system. I wish we could carry on. The voting system we have in this country, nobody's going to change that because they know that they'll probably lose out. 16-year-olds voting pretty soon, I would think, probably within the next 10 years. So if you happen to be 6, as somebody suggested, you've got a few more years to wait. Thank you very much for coming on this programme. The world is changing. This country will change undoubtedly with Thursday's result. But we will be back with Roundtable. I hope to have your company then. From me, David Foster, and my guests, goodbye for now.